AOR community. I'm the co-moderator along with Beth Van, who is in the West Coast of the US, so can't join us today. But we're very excited to offer this webinar today about shifting the focus, applying the survivor-centered approach to PSEA in the aid sector. So this is a AOR COP only webinar. So most of you are familiar with this, but I did want to just say a few words because I know that we've got some new members of the community of practice who are joining us today, just to reinforce what we're doing over here in the AOR community of practice. So the GBV AOR, of course, is the global working group for gender-based violence and emergencies, and we sit underneath the Global Protection Cluster. And the community of practice is part of the 3-phase Managing GBV and Emergencies learning program. There is an online free course that you can take, and then there is the face-to-face course that many of you, I recognize your names from, have taken. And then the community of practice is part of the 3rd phase of ongoing learning, providing support, capacity building, and developing for GBV specialists. So as well as the emails that we share with the and the conversations that we have online through our software groups.io, we also do webinars, and we have training courses online as well. Right now, we're running the mindfulness-based trauma-informed frontline course for GBV specialists to work on your own management of stress. We're having an advocacy training for GBV specialists coming up that will be geared towards the Asia region for that time zone. And last year, we also offered a course on diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, and sexual expression for GBV specialists too. So this webinar came up because, you know, a lot of the conversations that we've been seeing around have been about sexual exploitation and abuse and how do we respond to it. And we've been hearing a lot from members of our community of GBV specialists that there's a lot of kind of contradictions and some kind of struggles that we might be having. So when we saw Lucy and Martina's paper come out, I jumped upon the chance to invite them to come and speak. So what we'll be doing today is, after I finish talking to you about the community of practice, I'm going to turn it over to Martina Brostrom and Lucy Heaven-Taylor, who are the authors of the report. And they're going to talk to us a bit more about what's in it and how it came about. And then we've invited 2 members of the community of practice, Eric Dentor, who works with UNICEF, and Jennifer Ndugu from International Medical Corps, who's based in South Sudan. And I'll let them introduce themselves when they come, but they will be reflecting a bit about their impressions when they read the report, and also about their work with GBV survivors and how they work with the SEA system. So, of course, we're very happy to hear from you all, and we put some time in the webinar for you to be able to ask questions too. So please, in the chat, feel free to, in the chat, you can introduce yourself. I'll also be monitoring the chat. But if you have some questions for our speakers, feel free to put that in the Q&A. Just another note, because we often get this question, we will share with everyone who registered for the webinar the PowerPoint presentations afterwards, as well as the recording of this webinar. It is being recorded, and you can find all of the GBV AOR Community of Practice webinars on our YouTube channel, and I'll put that in the chat as well as we go through the webinar. So without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Martina and Lucy.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Martina Brostrom, and I work as a project manager in the CHS Alliance. I've been there since 1st of September 2021, to be exact. And I'm leading a project around closing the accountability gap to better protect victims and survivors of against sexual abuse, exploitation, and harassment. It's a project that takes place in 3 humanitarian settings. We're focusing our work in Cox's Bazar of Bangladesh, in the Amara region of Ethiopia, and in Palestine. And basically the aim of the project is to listen to victims and survivors around how they feel that a victim survivor-centered approach should look like for them, and then build best practice and guidance upwards, rather than looking at what already exists and then trying to implement it at the country level. And so just to say as well, the first kind of component of this project was really around scoping what's already there. And so Lucy, who is my co-presenter today, she'll be sharing a little bit more about one of the things that we evidenced. And just to say as well that we looked at what existed in terms of best practices and global guidance existing for how to deliver a victim and survivor-centered approach, and also building on participatory action research from these three settings. But I think my role today is a little bit share my own story, also, and why I feel a burning passion for this work and why there is such dire need to really sort of change existing practice for how we respond to PSEA. I was myself, I've been working before joining the CHS Alliance, I've been working in the AIDS sector for 20-something years. And when I was 10 years or so into my career, I was a victim of a sexual assault by the deputy executive director in the organization I worked for. And it was quite a traumatizing experience, happened on the sidelines of a work event. And I really got to experience firsthand what the trauma, the added trauma that can happen, not only by sort of having an experience like that, but also trying to survive in an organization, maintaining your job. And it was just a very, very difficult experience overall. And so maybe just to go back then in time, back to 2015, and say what happened to me and some of the lessons that I've learned. And then hopefully, that can highlight and inspire others to see how we as sort of experts or practitioners could maybe do a better job within our own organizations. So just to say that, maybe going back to my disclosure, so the event itself and the victimization happened then, as I said, during a work event. It was abroad. I was far away from home, but I did confide and disclose to a close friend, to my supervisor at the time, and also to my mother, actually. I needed that level of support. And it took me several months before I was ready to disclose in the organization. I'd worked there for 10 years, as I said, so I was quite familiar, and in management positions, so I was quite familiar with the organizational culture and the lax application of rules. We did not have a complaints mechanism, and as it happens, my perpetrator was also a very close friend of the executive director of the organization. So I felt very small in the larger scheme of things. There was a whistleblower protection policy, there was a sexual harassment policy, everything looked sort of as if it was something that one could walk through, but they really were just papers in the drawer, as I came to later experience. The retaliation started almost immediately because the buzz got around that there was a complaint. Also, because I had spoken informally, the processes had necessitated that you take an informal resolution first. So I tried to reach out to the ombudsman of the organization, the staff association, the chief of staff, the executive director. I had all that round. They were all men. I went through the whole rounds, and everybody had the same message for me, which was very much, forget about this, don't kill your career over this, just sort of brush it off and move on. And there was my personal experience, but also, I did not want it to happen to somebody else. And I think everybody in the organization at that point knew who the perpetrator was, because he was known to every woman working there. I think what wasn't known, and which the secret that I thought I was the alone to sit on, was the fact that he was a sex offender. And I really struggled with how to go about kind of surviving. I was a mother of 3 and I was a breadwinner of my family, how I would sort of juggle that with that need to also disclose, and not for my own accountability, but holding him to account and protecting other women in the organization and also outside. We were working with HIV, so very many vulnerable community, ranging from sex worker to LGBTIQ, trans, young women and girls, etc. And actually that turned out to be a really difficult thing, because many in the organization had this sort of heightened sense of self, that we were very liberal, we were very much fighting for the sexual reproductive rights of key communities. And it was very difficult when people were confronted with what was inside and what had happened to me, it was very difficult to reconcile that. And so I actually ended up losing a lot of friends in the process. The retaliation was quite immediate. It took forms like blocking my work, not having my papers approved, being blocked for duty travel, being sort of mastering techniques in meetings, being yelled at, friends and colleagues coming back saying that they wouldn't dare to sit with me in the cafeteria, only meeting outside of work. There was a whole kind of cramming down. I had to plead to finally when the retaliation got so bad, I went through the formal complaints process, and I was only told then that the statute of limitations was only 3 months at the time, so I couldn't have my case investigated. I then had to get a lawyer to try to ask, and finally the case was investigated by the now infamous WHO IOS, who have since been heavily criticized for investigating or not investigating some of the sexual abuse, exploitation, harassment, and the big sex for jobs scandals in the Congo. So when I filed then the report, what nobody knew was that I actually had logged the case with my government, and I think that was a real something that really saved me, because it was difficult for them to really be able to pretend that nothing had ever happened. They did, though, do what can only be described as the botched investigation lasting for 14 months. I found out about the results of the investigation through a press release on the website of the organization. I was at my desk, I refreshed my email, and I got a notification saying that he was innocent, was the word they use, which anybody working on this would know, that an unsubstantiated report, especially when you're using an evidentiary threshold of beyond reasonable doubt, can't be interpreted to be an innocence. Never mind. What did really change the course in my case was the tremendous support that I had when speaking publicly about what had happened to me, and the unforgettable support that I had from within the HIV community, from the women's movement and the civil society in general, both in terms of watchdogging the process, protesting, speaking up. And this was now in the midst of the whole Aid to Me Too movement, and that also gave a sort of gave me air under my wings. So that gave me some strength to keep on battling. Basically, long story short, the Secretary General of the United Nations reopened the case. It was reinvestigated. 4.5 years later, I finally got a letter of apology. I'm still litigating against them. And while I continue to do my work, I think my lessons learned from this period of time was that disclosure takes time. Nobody can be rushed to disclose. Reporting is very, very risky, and we need to have all the safeguards in place when people do come forward a report. We can't ask people to report. It's unethical, I'd say, to ask people to come forward and report something if we aren't there to be able to protect them and support them when they do. Investigations are really painful. They require a lot of preparation. Civil society's role is essential, both as watchdogs and as facilitator and providers of support. Self-care is really pivotal, it shouldn't be underestimated. And I think that love and friendships really matter in this period of time. So even as a sort of bystander in the process, or as a colleague or a peer, not sort of turning away and turning towards your organization because they pay your salary is important. And I really think that, I ended up actually quite vindicated. I got the letter of apology. My perpetrator was found guilty. He had left with a golden handshake, so there wasn't accountability for the perpetrator as such. And the organization was found to have a toxic work culture through an independent review. Still, I was left with this feeling that the longer it dragged, the worse it got. And I think if there was one message, there is also the message of timing. It's important to follow the survivor, I think, at their pace, but it's also important for the organization to not linger and make the process more painful than it has to be. And with that, I'll turn to Lucy to see how some of the evidence that we've found during the course of this project or heard from some of the country research we've been doing also mirrors what my experience is. And with that, I want to say that I think each experience is perhaps unique. Mine is a workplace. I'm a Swedish woman working in the UN. It can't be compared, but there is a universality to some of the kind of pain and trauma that comes with this. And so I want to turn over to you, Lucy. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Martina. So I already know parts of your story, obviously. I've heard it, but to hear it all laid out like that is just incredibly shocking, as I'm sure we're all experiencing. For me personally, it's a call to action. Again, I've just to give a bit of background for myself, I'm a safeguarding and PSEA expert. I've been working on these issues for around 20 years now. So for a large amount of time before this was really a well-known area of practice. And even still, after all that time, when I hear stories like Martina's, it shocks me and it reinvigorates my need to carry on working on this issue. And to know that it just doesn't have to be that way. We can do this well. There is a better way. Just to say that I'm calling from my phone, so I apologise in advance if there are any issues with my audio. I've just put myself on video just so that I can introduce myself to you all. But I think what I'll do now is go ahead and stop my video, just in case. Okay, so as Martina said, we've been working on this paper, Closing the Accountability Gap to Better Support Survivors of SEAH. I think I've described it before, I think it's fair to say it's a labour of love for both of us. We've just put everything that we've learned and experienced over the last sort of 10 or 20 years of working in this sector has been poured into this paper. So it's an honour to share it with you all, the community of practice today. So the slide that you'll see on the screen now just tells you a little bit about how we've structured this report. So what we decided to do was, instead of structuring it around how organisations respond to cases of SEAH, we've also taken the path of the survivor and the journey that they may find themselves on from victimisation and onwards to their contact with the organisation. Of course, we recognise that a survivor's journey is never linear, and this is quite a reductive way of looking at things, but for the purposes of the paper, that's how we decided that we would structure it. And just to say that the paper covers response to SEAH. There's also plenty of work to be done, obviously, on prevention, but what we wanted to look at specifically was how organisations respond to SEAH. And to say that speaking to you as a community of practice of people who work on GBV, obviously a large area of the work that we do on PSEAH is GBV work. But we also have the added area of practice in that not only are we responsible for making sure that the survivor is not re-traumatised and case managed and is referred to the relevant services and so on, but we also have the additional piece of work in that we need to hold organisations accountable for harm that they have caused through their programming and staff. So there's an additional area of practice there that we need to consider when we're looking at PSEAH. And I know that sometimes that does bring us into areas of tension between honouring those two commitments, and maybe we'll unpack that a little bit more in the presentation and in the questions. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we start with victimisation. So as I say, the report takes the journey of the survivor. So we start by looking at victimisation and really looking at the harm and the impact that can have on survivors as a reminder of what it is exactly that we're dealing with. The organisation has not come into play yet, but we felt that it was important to start the journey where the survivor starts their journey. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Sarah. So each of these sections on the journey, we've looked at what our research has found us about what the gaps and the challenges are. We've looked at what existing best practice there is in the sector, because there is really good practice out there. obviously wasn't applied in Martina's case and in many of the cases that we learn about, but it does exist. And then we give our recommendations to how we think we can better be survivor-centred in the response that we give. Now, these are the results of our research and our analysis of this. This is very much a starting point, this paper. So we're sharing our recommendations with you in the spirit of we would love to hear from you what you think of these recommendations, whether you think we've identified the correct recommendations, whether there are others that we could add, any thoughts that you have on this. So to start with disclosure, from our research analysis, we recommend that first of all, organisations are prepared to receive disclosures. Quite often organisations will have a whistleblowing hotline, or they'll have a designated person to deal with disclosures, but actually anyone can disclose at any time to any person in your organisation. They won't necessarily know about or choose to use the paths that you have for disclosing. So it's important that the whole organisation is prepared. And we recommend as part of that, that any staff who come into contact with members of the community have at least a basic training on how to receive a disclosure that does not, in a way that does not re-traumatise the survivor, and that they know how to confidentially refer that disclosure to the relevant part of the organisation. We also recommend that survivors are never influenced to disclose sexual exploitation or abuse. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, many agencies have more formalised reporting mechanisms to enable people to report in as a large area of practice. But our first recommendation is that we should not necessarily rely on people who have experienced SEAH or the communities to let us know when SEAH is happening. Instead, we should be proactive. We should know what the risks are. We should be going out there to see what our staff are doing, rather than passively waiting for people and communities to report in concerns to us. With that in mind, where there are reporting mechanisms, our research found that survivors are most likely to report to trusted intermediaries. So organisations need to bear that in mind, and we recommend that they replicate this trusted intermediary process by training their PSEA focal points, particularly in being peers to whom people can report in SEAH concerns. And where there are reporting channels, of course, we already know this is a large area of practice, that they need to be designed in consultation with communities and different groups within that community to make sure that they are safe, accessible, appropriate and confidential. Next slide, please. So when a report does reach our organisation, our recommendations are that those report handling and case management procedures within the organisation to follow up on a report are designed together with vulnerable and at-risk groups to ensure that they are safe and appropriate. And that with case management, as with all of the work that we do on PSEA, of course, survivors are treated as experts in their own situation. We recommend that organisations allow anonymous reports. Some don't, because there's a fear that those reports may be malicious. Well, we need to be prepared for that, and we need to accept all reports at face value and follow up on them nevertheless. So we recommend allowing anonymous reports, and also no statute of limitations on reporting. So you can report any historical concern from any point in time that you might have about sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. We also recommend that survivors receive the support that we offer at their pace, recognising their journey, and also for as long as needed, which could be months or even years. Next slide, please. So referral to support services. I don't need to obviously tell you as a community of practice much about this. This is very much an area that, of course, you're expert in. But just to say that we recommend that hopefully before any reports even come into an organisation, that they have done a support service mapping. They've mapped what services are available in the area where they're working, and again made sure that they are safe and appropriate and accessible to anyone who might need those services. And also looking at services perhaps for specific communities that might need specific types of services, for example, the LGBT community, children, and so on. Assisted to access services. So that means not just giving them a list of phone numbers and letting them get on with it, but that we're actually, should they choose to access services, we're helping them and assisting them to do so. And finally, a reminder, of course, that whilst we act in, we try to follow the wishes of a survivor in our work on SEAH, when we're working with children, we act in the best interests of the child. So children under the age of 18, cases involving them will always be referred automatically to appropriate services when it is safe to do so. Next slide, please. So on to investigation, something that we hear a lot about. I think sometimes there are cases where organisations think investigation is the be-all and end-all of PSEAH, but of course, as we've seen, there are lots of different areas of practice on PSEAH, but investigation is the big one, and it does tend to be the one that people feel stuck on as well. So we recommend that investigations are done where possible, obviously with the consent of the survivor and those involved, and that's informed consent. We really need to be transparent with survivors what will happen if they consent to an investigation. And the fact that they're going to stay in the organisation, we may need to share their information in a court of law. If there's a tribunal, we might need to share that information with donors. So we really need to understand what it is we are asking of the survivor and make that clear to them. We recommend, of course, that investigators are trained and experienced in survivor-centred approaches, and that their approaches are trauma-informed. Martina touched on the issue of balance of probability. Some organisations use beyond reasonable doubt. We don't consider that's appropriate for an administrative workplace investigation. In other types of workplace investigation, balance of probability is considered an appropriate evidentiary threshold, and we recommend that for investigations as well. Next slide, please. So the next area of practice we looked at is organisational decision making. Now, this was an important area of practice to look at. There's plenty that organisations have done in terms of policies and procedures, but where it all tends to fall down is actually when organisational decisions are made, particularly by individuals at a senior level. You can have your reporting mechanisms and your policies, but somebody at some point is going to need to make a decision at various points in dealing with SEAH. It was this was that we could share, interestingly enough, but we will carry on looking, and anything that you have obviously would be well received. We recommend that, of course, decisions are made in the best interests of the survivor rather than that of the organisation. Sounds obvious. You probably wouldn't be surprised to learn how many times, certainly in my experience, that has not necessarily happened. We recommend that disciplinary outcomes for perpetrators are consistent. So often we see different disciplinary outcomes for perpetrators for the same kind of misconduct. And unfortunately, a lot can depend on how senior they are in the organisation, how punitive those disciplinary outcomes are. And we recommend that anonymised data is shared on cases so that we can compare and contrast and analyse what the outcomes are of investigations. And of course, we recommend that whistleblowers are not retaliated against, either for reporting SEAH or for exposing malpractice or negligence in dealing with cases. Next slide, please. So we're moving now to the final, but perhaps most important area that our report looked at, which is redress and compensation. Again, not much that we could find in terms of evidence and best practice around this. And yet, a lot of the time, this is the most important factor for survivors. Our sector is notoriously poor at redress and compensation for survivors. We recommend that organisations are committed to what are their administrative and often legal obligations to ensure redress. And we recommend, of course, that the survivor's wishes for redress are respected. We also recommend that where the sexual exploitation, abuse or harassment is a criminal act, that the survivor is facilitated to access legal aid should they wish to do so. We also point out in the reports that there is compensation for other types of harm that are caused by organisations. For example, if they knock over and injure or kill somebody in a traffic accident where it's an organisation's driver or vehicle, then there are processes for compensation. So why not processes for compensation for other kinds of harm caused by the organisation, i.e. sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment? We very much recommend that organisations look at their practices on redress and compensation in other areas and apply that as well to these kinds of harms. Next slide, please. So that's an overview of our report and the areas that we look at. Obviously, as I said, this is meant to be very much a kicking off point for discussion. And you no doubt will have lots of ideas and comments and feedback on our findings. So going to hand over now back to Sarah, our chair, to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Lucy. And I am encouraging everyone to please put their questions in the chat, but there is a very quick question that popped up right now. Lucy, maybe you can answer it quickly. Is there a standard length of time for an investigation? Someone wanted to.
That's a really good question. We say in as timely fashion as you are able to do so, bearing in mind that lots of people's kind of futures are riding on this, but not at the sacrifice of being thorough and good practice. So, I mean, I would say the investigations I do, it's preferably weeks, not months, let's say. And if it is months, a small number of months. When you hear of investigations like Martina's that are taking, 18 months or so on, that's absolutely not acceptable. So as quickly as we can do, quickly as we are able to do a quality investigation.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucy. Now, I'd like to introduce you. I'm going to turn off the PowerPoint so you can see our speakers if they're able to put their video on. We have two speakers who are members of the community of practice. Eric Dentor, who works currently with UNICEF on their GBV and emergencies. And Eric and I go way back. We've known each other for some time. He has agreed to come in and talk to us while on holiday in Liberia. And then Jennifer Ndugu, who is working with the International Medical Corps in South Sudan, where she and her team provide case management services to SEA survivors. So I'm going to turn the floor over to them, to Eric first and then Jennifer, to kind of reflect on the report and their own experiences. And in the meantime, please keep your questions coming in the Q&A or in the chat. Eric, are you able to unmute? There you are.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning, colleagues from Monrovia, Liberia, where I'm currently taking my holiday. It is a pleasure to be here. Like Lucy mentioned, I'm actually using data from my phone, which is kind of getting disturbed by different calls that are coming in. But I will try to see how best I can be able to present a bit. And thank you so much, first, Martina, for sharing your experience, which I think has created more space and courage for colleagues who may be having similar experiences or who may want to share their experiences. And to Lucy, the both of you, for the wonderful report. I was able to look at the report. By the way of introduction, Sarah had already mentioned I work for UNICEF. And prior to working for UNICEF, I work in the field as well for different organizations on GBV, but also on PSEA. And currently with UNICEF, I'm working as a GBV and emergency specialist on the Global Emergency Response Team. On the report, I will try to put off my camera for now because I think the internet, but I will put it on again once the presentation is done at one point. But I will focus on three things from the report in terms of what is my reflection on the report in terms of the general overview of the report, but also some of the challenges that Lucy mentioned, what we have been seeing in the field, especially working on GBV as well as on PSEA. and also how this report can support us in the GBV community. So I will turn off my camera if that is okay with everybody, so that I don't lose the presentation at one point.
No problem.
All
I'll
right,
put
thank
back
you.
up the slides so that people have something to look at.
That will be great. So thank you so much. So on the report, I think reading the report yesterday, and I didn't have time to really go through the report in detail, but I feel the report is really, really excellent. And like I mentioned from the beginning, a big thank you to Lucy and Sarah, because what I have seen with the report is that it identifies some of the prevailing challenges we have in the field. Lucy mentioned them already. Working on GBV and PSEA, we have seen all of these challenges, from victimization to disclosure to investigation. How can we make this more survivor center, where organizations are looking at system, their reputation, but not really looking at survivor safety and well-being. We have also seen that the report will help us in terms of the work we do in the GBV community, to look at, because if you look at sexual exploitation and abuse, as we mentioned, it is a form of gender-based violence, but organizations do not have contractual commitment or accountability for GBV. They do have contractual accountability for sexual exploitation and abuse, which means that when sexual exploitation and abuse occurs, perpetrators must be held accountable. What that accountability has not really focused on is around the survival, safety, and well-being. So we are very fast in looking at the investigations are completed, like Lucy mentioned. Some organizations do that within 28 days. Some organizations do that within 90 days. But what has not been, we have not been looking at in detail is how survivors can be supported throughout the journey, as Lucy mentioned. And one of the things that I have seen with the report is looking at the practical recommendations in terms of what does this mean for us? How do we make it survivor center from the different phases, from the starting of the case, if we have disclosure, up to the support to the survivor. And then I think for us, it is a learning for us for continuous advocacy, because some of us in the GBV work, we continue to push, even though some of our organizations have different units responsible for protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. Some of us as GBV specialists, we are always there to make sure that we push, we advocate to make sure that survivor center is a priority, that services for survivors are in place, even before talking about setting up reporting mechanisms or raising awareness on sexual exploitation and abuse. And in terms of the challenges, I don't think I will go into detail because Lucy mentioned them, but just some reflection on some of the challenges mentioned. Like I mentioned around the contractual accountability, I think this is where we need to really, really focus on where there are limitations when it comes to response. In terms of prevention, in terms of risk mitigation, you see that risk assessment have been done as part of the good practices that Lucy mentioned. What we have not seen happening much in the field is around the response, even though we have some good practices, but I think we need to focus a bit on that. In terms of the investment that goes into the work, we also see that there is a lot of investment nowadays going around systems, around PSEA training, around CBCMs, around awareness raising. And sadly, in some of the locations where we are investing on PSEA prevention and risk mitigation efforts, we do not have even services for survivors. In as much as we are looking at reporting and all of that, we have to also make sure that services for survivors. So for one of the things I have been pushing in the field, and we have been pushing with some colleagues on the call, is to make sure that we cannot have PSEA mechanisms in place if we do not have support services, because lack of support services for survivors may also impede reporting if survivors do not even know what services are available or where to access these services. So limited investment for dedicated capacity and services to support survivors is something we continue to see almost in every sector. The GBV community tries to put some of those services in place, but again, there should be that connection between the PSEA work and the GBV work, because in some organizations, these are PSEA efforts are kind of separate. So this is something we need to invest. And Lucy mentioned around the capacity for all frontline workers. I think this is also a challenge. When you have emergencies or humanitarian crisis, you have huge deployment, huge recruitment. huge mobilization in terms of personnel, in terms of community volunteers, community mobilizers that are representing these our different organizations. Sadly, not all of them are trained on how to handle disclosures of incident. So for the GBV community, we try to push to make sure that all the frontline workers are trained on how to safely handle disclosure of GBV incident. What we have been doing is to include handling of sexual exploitation and abuse incident in terms of, again, contractual accountability we have. So this is something I think we will really want to invest a bit more in. On the reporting, Lucy mentioned that already. One thing we really want to see is to make sure that reporting mechanisms are linked to services. Again, this is something I have seen in the field where people will go in the community, talk about sexual exploitation and abuse, talk about these things, yet they do not have even services in those places or even informing survivors when they disclose where to really seek these services. Case management in terms of handling, it is interesting to note that for organizations that have some sort of protection services, kind of try to manage case management ethically somehow. But then you have organizations that do not have protection programming, and then case management is done by anybody. So I think this is something that we also have to recognize, that case management can be treated as a specialized service, especially from service provision perspective, meaning not everybody should be providing these services, even in terms of first engagement with the survivor. So in as much as we may want to have management decisions in terms of how to handle these cases, service provision should be something that is being handled by specialists. So this is somewhere I think in terms of having dedicated resources to make sure that there are ethical referrals, and then having specialists in place is something that we need to look at. But also just to make sure, even when Lucy was mentioning about the referrals, to make sure that we do map the services. I think it is important to map the services. But even if we do map the services in the middle of the response, if the services are not available, then the challenge becomes making sure that these services are available. And the push which I have been advocating for in the field is to just assume that this is going to happen and make sure that services are in place in the first place before you even talk about setting up reporting mechanism and all of that kind of stuff. When you do mapping of services, then you will be able to already find what services are in place. And then finally, around the investigation and the redress that Lucy mentioned, where needed, I think there is a need to also consult with specialists. Like we have seen some of the investigation. Being an investigator myself, some of the investigators probably may not have that capacity, skills and capacity in terms of how they look at the survivor welfare, survivor well-being and safety during investigation. In as much as the investigations are intended for information finding on what has happened, caring for survivors is something that should be a priority. And in as much as we can include that in trainings, I think there is a need, where there is a need to consult with specialists, even before this investigation begins or during the investigations, I think can be something of importance. And in terms of how this report, I think we support the GBV community of practice. As a closing from my end, I think it will help to enhance linkages between the GBV work and PSEA work. In some contexts, we see organizations doing both GBV and PSEA work, and it's easy to draw on the linkages. But in some situations, you may have some organizations working on PSEA without having services in place. So I feel that we need to really focus a bit more on that. And this report will definitely help to enhance that linkage, the linkages between GBV and PSEA work. Because I feel, and I still feel, that PSEA efforts can.
Oh, I think we lost Eric. Eric, I think your connection is blocking you from telling us your true feelings. Do you want to try again? Okay. Eric, I think your connection is letting you down.
When they are linked to the appropriate end choices. Yes, Sarah. I think there is a call coming in.
Yes, and it garbled most of what you were saying. You said, I truly believe, and then it dropped off. Okay. All right, well, Eric, I'm going to ask Jennifer. I'm going to turn over the mic to Jennifer. We're getting lots of good questions in the chat, and you're going to get some chances to talk again some more while responding to them. So Jennifer, do you want to turn your video on and we can invite you to speak?
Yes, Sarah. Thank you so much. I'll turn the video on for the introduction and then I'll put it off so that we can have a proper connection. My name is Jennifer Ndungu. I work for International Medical Corps in South Sudan. I've worked there for 4 years, and my background, I have experience in GBV programming, which I've done for the last 7 years, including providing services for SEA survivors, case management, psychosocial support activities, as well as working closely with SEA task force and community-based mechanism. I'll turn it off as I continue. I hope this is fine.
Totally fine. I'll put the PowerPoint back up just so everyone knows your name.
Yeah. So when I was looking at the report yesterday, I was relating with the challenges that we are experiencing when we are providing services for survivors, as well as issues around investigations and the potential risk that can cause to survivors, the caseworkers that are providing services, as well as the organization that is representing them or where the cases have been reported. And I feel that this report will go a long way in supporting partners working with supporting SEA survivors. And one of the important things that I was looking through is the disclosure or sharing of information about SEA cases, personal identifiable information either to the donors or to the SEA task force without the consent of the survivors. And as many organizations agree to mandatory reporting requirement of sharing survivors' information without the consent, it goes against the minimum requirements of ensuring survivor-centered approach where the identifiable information is kept safe. And you see that further, you never know who an alleged perpetrator may be, and sharing such sensitive information could potentially put a survivor, their families, and their organization to risk of repercussion from the survivor. And from my experience is that the such information requested from the donor, probably for their own accountabilities because they are funding the SEA programs. Like we have one of the program that we are implementing in South Sudan for SEA survivors providing case management. And you might find that the information is requested for their accountabilities as at some point to share with the organization where the staff has been reported and alleged to have perpetrated the incident of SEA. But this would mean that an additional layer of information to a new person who is not involved in directly providing services and care for the victim of SEA survivors. And this can come into conflict with the survivor-centered and trauma-informed approach, which will require the organization to seek consent from the survivor to follow up on SEA reports. And another thing that I was looking at is the investigation part, which has been highlighted very well in the report. And I was looking at the challenges that we face around that. Investigations are the areas where the SEA practice require the practice require a lot of skills in interviewing the survivors and understanding the context. But you find that sometimes this is the area where the risk has been highly highlighted. For example, in the camp setting where I have experience, you see that the space is very limited and the confidentiality is also limited. So it will be important before investigation is done for proper protection assessment and risk mitigation to be put in place. Otherwise, this might cause some beliefs. I have experience where in the case of investigation, you find that the pictures are needed to be taken, depending on the nature of the investigation, how it's tailored to be done. And in the camp setting, when the pictures are being taken, it draws the attention to the community, and the community living there, generally suspicious, would want to see what is happening. And this, in most cases, would cause a lot of questions and re-traumatizing to the survivors. And also, one of other things that I found is that in the course of the investigation, I think it will be important to have somebody who has been well trained and following up on the principles of investigations. This has been very well highlighted in the report, because we see in some instances whereby the investigators would be questioning the perpetrator before the survivors, and the perpetrator will have reached to the survivor, causing more risk, since you never know the questions that the perpetrator would be following up with the survivor to ask or to hinder the investigations. And this is one of the things that have been highlighted there, and also experience that we have been facing there as we facilitate the investigation through as a caseworker through the investigators. And I think it is important that the survivor, as much as they do not consent to the investigation, to have more, to get to know the pro and cons, and to be able to decide on whether these need to be taken, an investigation need to be taken off with their consent. And if they do not, it is important for them to know the consequences as well as the outcome of them not consenting or them consenting to the investigations. And another point that I can highlight on the service provision is it's important to have the services in place, because we go out there, we create awareness, we work closely with the community-based networks, but are there services that are available to make sure that the survivors are accessing them? Because if there are no services that are there, it means that we are causing more harm to the survivor, because they are going to tell their story, but there will be nobody to make sure that the services are provided to them. And when the services are being provided to them, if the services are available, it is important to make sure that we offer them in a way that will not cause harm to them. We have experience whereby the donors would be funding only services for SEA survivors. They would be funding the case management services or the livelihood services only. And in this case, when the services are being implemented within the women and girls safe spaces, the rest of the members of the women and girls safe spaces would be looking at the other group that is receiving a special kind of services. And that will be raising an eyebrows, because why are they receiving livelihood and the rest of the members are not receiving these particular services? So even to the donors, it is important to make sure that the services are harmonized, the services are accessible to the entire members of beneficiaries, for example, the women within the women and girls safe spaces, so that it doesn't end up feeling as if we have discriminated certain group of people and then provided services to one particular group of people who can be easily identified and target for stigma. I think that is it. Yeah, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really so much information. We're so glad that you were able to join us today. Eric, I know that you got cut off as you were making your last 2 points, so I'll invite you to make the points. And then we have a lot of questions in the chat that I'm gonna turn it over to. So go ahead, Eric.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry for that cut. I was just talking about how this report will be able to strengthen our linkages, especially GBV work and PSEA work. And I was saying that I truly believe that PSEA efforts can be more effective and functional when they are linked to services that are context-specific, age and gender appropriate, and that are based on survival wishes and consent. And also in terms of services, we just have to make sure that those services, it will help us to continue the advocacy on first the availability of the services, but also the accessibility. Because what we have seen is that most of the time we have services that are available, but then in terms of access, there are barriers to accessing these services, whether people will have to pay for these services, then the service might be available, but if people have to pay for the service, then that service is not accessible. And then the acceptability and quality. I think this is something, and then of course that way encourage reporting. And one of the reasons why we don't have reporting can be linked to lack of services. And then finally, it's around the follow-up care. And I think we have some conversation around that, not just the short-term care that we provide for survival, but what will be the long-term care. And I think there will be a broader conversation on that. And I saw a lot of stuff coming on the GBV pocket guide. And I think this is where we have, from the GBV community, we have been trying to make sure that every training for the frontline worker addresses that. The challenge we have been having with that is that you have some PSEA training that probably do not look at that disclosure piece. So we are trying to make sure that every training, whether it is a PSEA training, we make sure that that piece of how to handle disclosure comes in. And then the last challenge is around the mandatory reporting accountability. So people get to know that they have to disclose. And they say, oh, reporting is not a choice, it's a mandate. Yes, it is a mandate that you have to report, but what will be the accountability piece in terms of how survival can be safe? I think that we have time to talk about that. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks for your last point, because I think that summarizes many of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. And I'd like to invite all of the panelists, Martina, Lucy, Eric, and Jennifer, to reflect and tell us what you think about. There's the challenge of mandatory reporting or zero tolerance that PSEA requires, but then there is our feminist-focused survivor-centered approach, which means that oftentimes the survivor does not wish to participate in the investigation or does not wish to go forward with that, and yet is pressured, as you've mentioned, to all the weight of holding the perpetrator accountable falls on the shoulders of the survivor participating in these processes. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. And can it really be a survivor-centered PSEA approach with this tension?
Sarah, this is Lucy. Is it okay if I go ahead and answer that one first?
Please.
Okay. So yeah, so the issue of mandatory reporting versus a survivor-centered approach, obviously it comes up a lot. Firstly, I would say that it is it's not all organisations that really push and promote a mandatory reporting. I know that it is mandatory in some, but not all. From my perspective, I think mandatory reporting is far more nuanced than it might seem. So I understand why some organisations have mandatory reporting. It is because for so long in our sector, SEAH has gone unreported, and it's really important that staff know that it's all of their responsibility to raise concerns, even if they think that it might be being dealt with by someone else, or it's just a rumour. However, as you will of course absolutely know, as GBV practitioners, that raises many questions. I think it comes in two parts as well. There's should reporting be mandatory, and also then I think there's the second piece on survivor consent for investigations. So firstly, in terms of mandatory reporting, I think that the policy should be applied in a lot more nuanced way than they currently are. There's a massive imbalance of power amongst staff members. That means that for many staff members, let's say, take for example, a national staff member who's junior, who's just joined the organisation, is in a lot of a different position of power than, let's say, a senior international staff member. And to take punitive measures for that junior staff member for not reporting SEA when they might genuinely be at risk of retaliation, I don't think that's an appropriate way to enforce that policy. There are also all sorts of other issues. For example, people in the LGBTQ community would have very real fears of mandatory reporting if to report might draw attention to the fact that they're in that community, for example, in a context where that might not necessarily be a safe thing to draw attention to. In terms of consent for follow-up, including investigation, again, I think that's a very nuanced set of decisions that need to be made. Of course, on the one hand, we want to be led by the survivor's wishes, but as I said, on the other hand, there is this issue of needing to be aware that there is a perpetrator potentially within our organisation who may continue to cause harm. And of course, we never ever put the burden of solving this problem or fixing this problem on the survivor at all. It is not their fault. Even Martina mentioned this and feeling responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen to other women. It's not your responsibility. It's the responsibility of the perpetrator and the organisation to prevent that from happening. So if a survivor doesn't consent to an investigation, then I think I skipped over it in my slide, but one of our recommendations in the report is to actually consider, do we need an investigation? Is that the only course of action in this particular case? And often it isn't. There are other courses of action that we can take, and we go into that in a bit more detail in the report. Might a survivor consent to an investigation without their involvement? That's worth exploring. If they absolutely don't consent for us to take action at all, that's when we begin to need to make decisions in the organisation as to actually what are we going to do to balance off the need to respect the survivor's wishes versus the potential harm within our organisation. And that's when you might look at different actions rather than investigation. And that comes back to the section on organisational decision making, because then there need to be sensible and informed decisions made around that still respect being survivor-centred. So sorry, that's a little bit of a long answer to that question, but I think because it is a really difficult subject area. So I'll hand over to others to see what their thoughts are on that.
Eric, Jennifer, do you have any thoughts? Martina?
Maybe I can just add a point on what Lucy mentioned. Thank you, Lucy. And I think over the years, this has been a very big debate. If you go back to the Cisco principles on the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, where it says one of the principles is that where staff member develops suspicion, they should report. And I think in terms of the awareness work that has gone in the field is that staff or other personnel know that reporting is not a choice, it's a mandate. And what it does is that there is no conversation, and it is not even allowed to have a conversation between with the survivor to find out whether the reporting can be done or not. So I think we can have a conversation around that. That's not going to change over the months or over the years in terms of whether reporting can even be made without consulting the survivor. Now, the points Lucy mentioned on the consent of the survivor to participate in the investigation, I think the way we need to really focus on. If for any reason the survivor is not willing to participate in the investigation, what can we do? I think the way we need to really look at what the organization can do, like Lucy mentioned. If the survivor does not want to participate in the investigation, I think the survivor choices and wishes should be respected. And then the organization can look at the best option to see how best that can be done. But what has been happening is that survivors are likely are forced to participate because of this accountability piece. But I think we need to change that narrative. Thank you so much.
Jennifer or Martina, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I think from my side, it's important to consider the survivor-centered approach, whereby the wishes and the consent of the survivor is the priority, because we are looking at the safety and security threat that might face the survivor. And as much as the investigation might be, it's important to hold the perpetrators accountable. It is also important to look at the survivor as a person and see how best we can facilitate the healing process. So the survivor as a person should be the center of our activities. It's be the center to our actions, so that we don't end up causing the harm to the survivor in the process of facilitating investigation and other forms that would need us to share the information. And if the survivor does not consent, I think it's important to consider other options for resolving the case. If the investigation is necessary, it's important to see whether there are other sufficient report or any other witness that could provide the information, or to involve an expert for advice to be able to proceed after a proper risk assessment has been conducted, rather than exposing survivor to some risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Martina, do you have anything to say? If not, I'll go to the next question. I see you unmuted yourself, so go for it.
No, I just wanted to add, I think also in the report, I think everything has been mentioned. I agree with the other speakers. Just to say as well, I think there is a value in what we've done in the report regarding separating disclosure from reporting. And I think there is need for that time for people to disclose to somebody and then think through how the reporting should happen. And I think that when we speak about mandatory reporting, it's as if, you know, we have to make the assumption that there has already, if the reporting comes from the survivor, they've hopefully already worked through that process and understood and have an informed decision about how they want to participate. So just to add that element, that I think access to services and that the survivor would need in a way could follow a disclosure. And coming back to the issue of reporting, that's very much about addressing the violation, the perpetrator, and the organizational accountability, and that could be handled with or without risk and to the victim and the survivor.
Yeah, thank you for that, Martina. I also just wanted to take a moment to say that I also lodged a complaint against my former organization, MSF, in 2018. And I immediately began to be bullied by their investigators to participate in the investigation. And I feel like I'm pretty empowered in these things. And it was intimidating and overwhelming. In the end, I said I refused. But it's something I have a lot of interest in, and we're seeing an increased interest in investigations. So this decision-making when an investigation goes forward is a really important topic for us to think about. There's also a lot of other questions in there, and I don't want to take too much time. So a number of questions about how to manage the dealing with the perpetrator, because the perpetrator is often someone that we work with, and they often evade accountability by fleeing from the area or getting promoted out and promoted up that we see in many of these agencies. There's been a couple of questions in the chat as well about how is there a joint mechanism to keep a list of perpetrators? And I know there's some efforts on them, but let me turn it over to the panelists to respond.
I'm hesitant to jump in and go first again.
Go ahead, Lucy, everyone's chatting, so it's okay.
I don't know if I can't see the list of participants, so I don't know if we have Inez on the call.
Inez is on the call.
Might be able to answer this better than me if so, but there is the is she on the call? Hi Inez, I'm gonna quickly speak for you. I don't know if there's a chance
no,
to bring
she was on the call. I think she's
there is the disclosure of misconduct scheme.
Yeah, she's left the call. She was there and then she left already. So it's just you.
Oh, she has. Maybe she lost connection. Yeah, so within the NGO field, there is a disclosure of misconduct scheme, which commits to a certain standard of reference checking and providing references. There is also clear check within the UN system. So we don't hold a list of perpetrators because that would be against data protection, but we do have systems in the sector to at least try and prevent as much as possible perpetrators being rehired.
Okay. Eric, Martina, or Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on this about dealing with the perpetrator and keeping the survivor safe from the perpetrator while this process is going on?
Hi.
Go ahead, Martina.
No, I just wanted to say 2 points that came up. I think from the UN perspective is very, very clear. I think that is the 1946 rules of immunities and privileges of the UN, that when it comes to criminal conduct, it has to be, the immunity does not hold up for criminal conduct. and that should be waived. And similarly for INGOs and NGOs, normally that's enshrined as part of their registration in country that they have to abide by national criminal law. So organizations really should not evade national criminal law. I think the only thing to be considered is when there would be punitive law that would be very bad for the organization. And then we see the same kind of tension regarding that we were just discussing regarding when it comes to mandatory reporting, we see the same tension when it comes to criminal accountability. But I would say that all NGOs normally are obliged to report in such behaviors because these are crimes under a lot of legislations, and that those national laws should be reported. Of course, when there is, as I said, with the caveat that when there is real risk for the victim or survivor because of the political situation or because of the, how they self-identify, then those, I would say, are the mitigating circumstances when due consideration needs to be given to that.
Great, thank you. Eric?
Yeah, I was just trying to say something just to add on the point of Lucy and Martina. I think one of the challenges is that we have very limited information in terms of, because when investigations are done for us, like if reporting or disclosures are made, and then the process is supported and investigations are completed, sometimes we have very limited information in terms of what the outcomes are, in terms of what has happened to the perpetrator or not. So it remains the management decision in terms of how the perpetrator can be held accountable. But I think, yeah, there is a need to really continue to see how best, because whether it is from the HR processes in terms of recruitment and then trying to do this reference check, otherwise we continue to have perpetrators rehire and then continue to have these instances. But why it remains management decision, I think we can push to see how best that they can be transparent also in sharing this information.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing also. There's not a lot of guidance out there that I can find about guiding managers into making some of these decisions. I think they often feel overwhelmed too, and they tend to revert back to saying, okay, we'll get an investigation and we'll push that forward. And it just brings the process further along. And I'm doing a little bit of work about this in Eastern Europe right now, and we're getting a lot of requests. Just tell us what we need to do. We want a checklist, how we manage this. Well, all of us who work in gender-based violence know that these are not easily solved by checklists, and they require thinking through and really considering the needs of the survivor. Jennifer, did you want to add anything to this discussion, or I have one or two more questions? Go for it, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something, protection of survivors during the investigation process. And I was looking at it will be important to uphold to the principles of investigation, and especially confidentiality. And this is during the process of investigation, so that information does not go leaking to the perpetrator that might cause harm to the survivor. And also important of keeping the timelines where the investigation should be completed on timely basis to avoid further distress to the victim. And in this way, it will be safer to protect the survivor during the process of investigation, whereby they would know what is happening and what is the next course of action, and the information will not be out there to distress the survivor. So I think it's also important to consider the principles of PSEA when we are doing the investigations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, another question that popped up is, we're hearing a lot that there's often pressure from the donors to share information about survivors. And this is something I think all of us who work in GBV have struggled with, and why we invented the GBV information management system, the GBV IMS. Like, would you like to reflect a bit more on the limits of information sharing when it comes to these things, and what you would like the donors to know? Anyone? Jennifer, maybe you can start us off by sharing a bit about some of the pressure that you've seen happening with your work with survivors.
Yeah, thank you. One of the challenges that I mentioned earlier is on requests from the donors to share personal identifiable information about the survivor, and mostly because they are funding the projects that we are implementing. And you find that we fill the intake form, we record the information about the survivor, including all the identifiable information. And what the form says is that if the survivor consents to investigation, you can put there as they consented. And if they did not consent to the investigation, you can still say that they did not consent to the investigation, but still proceed and share that information to the donor. And one of the challenge is that not asking for permission or consent from the survivor goes against the minimum requirement of ensuring survivor-centered approach where the information is kept safe. And what I mentioned is that we never know who an alleged perpetrator may be, or the power they have, and this might potentially cause harm to the survivors, their family, or even the caseworkers that is providing the information. And most donors will be requesting that information for the accountability, one thing, or the staff to share with the organization where the alleged staff committed the PSEA case for the purpose of investigations. So, and I feel like most of organizations, they have policies, they are committed to, they can investigate their own staff. And if the staff belong to another organization, they can share that information to those particular organization or agency for them to be able to do the investigation. But sharing this information with a donor or a new person, it adds a layer of information to a new person that did not need to get the information since they are not providing direct service or care to the survivor. So that is one of the challenges that we have been facing for donor requesting for identifiable information for the survivors.
Thank you, Jennifer. Lucy or Eric, do you have any thoughts on that? Or else I have another question.
From my perspective, there's absolutely no need for the donors to know that information. I would think that there are probably two reasons why donors might need information on investigations. First of all, they might need it for more top-line analysis of what kind of SEAH is happening and how it's being dealt with, in which case that can be really top-line, completely anonymized information. They might need it because they want to quality assure the investigation that their partner is undertaking, in which case there are other ways that could be done that doesn't require them to have all of the confidential information. For example, they might ask a third party to come in and quality assure that investigation, to do an after action review or something similar, or they could even have a team of theirs to do that. But I think there needs to be a pushback and a conversation with donors as to why they are asking for this level of information, and how we can provide information that's useful to them and meets their needs, but doesn't in any way compromise confidentiality, particularly. I don't know if others have any thoughts on that.
You were breaking up a little bit at the end, but I think you were asking Martina if she had any thoughts on that.
No, I'm fine. Thanks, Sarah. I think it's all been said. I agree with the comments already made. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot of chatter going on in the chat, which is great. And maybe we can try to summarize some of it in a document and send it around after this webinar. But there's a lot of talk about keeping donors accountable, particularly for funding organizations that continue to hire perpetrators. There was one question specifically, I think, to you and Martina and Lucy, about the recommendations in your report and the accountability frameworks used to assess organizations' CHS compliance. Is there a link between the two of them?
Yeah, so this, Martina, I would say definitely. So you know, this work is also coming out of the CHS Alliance. And just to say that a lot of I said initially that a lot of the work that we were doing was based on an analysis of where we were seeing that there is gaps existing in accountability. So it's clear that for us, we agree on the state. We agree that SCAH is a form of gender-based violence, but we think that it manifests where organizations' accountability systems are breaking or that they aren't strong enough. So the link is that by strengthening your over accountability to affected people, then you are minimizing your risk. We have a tool called the PSEA index that could help organizations sort of self-appraise where they are and how strong their existing mechanisms are. Obviously, that is part of strengthening your overall accountability for the organization. And so the link with this work is very much, you know, how can the report that we're looking at here, you know, it contributes to prevention insofar that we're hoping that there is a learning from every case, and that by taking resolute action on perpetrators and being accountable to victims, that helps contribute to your overall organizational accountability. But this report really focuses on when that breach in accountability has occurred. So we already have an incident of SCAH and how the organization can then support the survivor in the journey that they need to take. I hope that kind of helps illuminate a little bit the linkages between the two.
Thank you, Martina. Okay, so we're at the last 5 minutes of our webinar, and this has been great. I've really enjoyed the discussion. So I'd like to ask our panelists just one last word from each of you that you would like everyone in the audience to take home from them about making PSEA action more survivor-centered. Something that you'd like to share. And we'll go with Lucy, then Martina, then Eric, then Jennifer. We'll give Jennifer the last word.
Goodness, that's a difficult question to answer in a soundbite. I think doesn't quite answer your question, but I think I would definitely like to see, you know, lots of linkages between those of us who work on PSEAH and those of us who work on gender-based violence, because, you know, obviously, as I said, there's a massive overlap in the work that we do, and I think having the GBV community kind of feeding in on this will massively strengthen what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Any thoughts, Martina?
Sorry, you're going to have to repeat the question for me. I had trouble hearing you when you were asking the question. Forgive me.
Sure. Just one last thought you'd like to leave the audience with about your report.
Yeah, I think that the next frontier that we really need to work on is regarding the redress and compensation. I really think that organizations have gotten away too long by thinking that investigation is a satisfiable outcome. It's not a satisfactory outcome for victims and survivors. And I really think that this is where we all need to put our joint effort into moving kind of the continuum beyond the investigation. It's not satisfactory to anybody else but the organization who can take action on the perpetrator.
Thank you, Martina. Eric, any last thoughts?
Quickly, 3 things from my end. One is that there should be investment into services for survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse, in addition to services for GBV. We cannot do PSEA without services for survivors. That is one. And then, as Lucy mentioned, that collaboration. And then 2, we want to see that linkages, that collaboration between the two, because you will realize that from the GBV community, I think the Survivor Center is being preached every day, but there should be more of seeing that within the PSEA community of practice, because you have more PSEA specialists who are actually not maybe response officers or protection officers themselves. So I think we want to see more of that collaboration. And then lastly, like Martina mentioned, the compensation piece. I think there are other consequences that come as a result. We had conversation yesterday, even maybe children born out of these incidents. How can we continue to provide support for them? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. And Jennifer, last word for you.
Yes. From my side, what I would like to say is that the way in which we manage the cases of SEA can make all the difference for the survivors' well-being and protection and safety. I know there are a lot of pressure out there to share information about identifiable information about the survivors without their consent. But the most important thing is to ensure that their wishes are protected and that they are empowered. And this will be it will go a long way in facilitating their healing process. So we don't give up. We continue to do what is best for survivors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And that was a great reminder of why we're all here in the GBV community of practice, is to support the survivors and to do what we can to make sure that their perpetrators are held accountable and that they receive the support that they need to heal. I'd like to thank you all again very much for participating. Lucy Heaven-Taylor and Martina Brostrom from CHS Alliance for their great report. Eric Dentor for taking time out on his much deserved home leave in Liberia. And Jennifer, who I just met through this webinar, also taking time out from her leave in Nairobi from her work in South Sudan. If you have any questions, you can always reach us at the GBV AOR Community of Practice at gbvcop@gmail.com or on the AOR website. And also I want to put a plug in there for the GBV Help Desk. You can also reach them for any questions you have on this. We've mentioned a few times the Resource and Safeguarding Hub that has a lot of materials on PSEA. While the community of practice is for GBV and emergencies survivor specialists, and we do sometimes talk about SEA, if you are a PSEA person, I think the Resources Safeguarding Hub can help you out a lot. Thank you all so much, and we'll be sending out the recording and the PowerPoints, and have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day. Thank you.